Madame Zille, do you know what it feels like to bury children who were not even old enough to curse their killers? That was the first line in his letter to Helen Zille, the former member of the National Assembly of South Africa. A letter soaked not in ink, but in history, blood, and the slow choking silence of betrayal. It wasn't written to accuse but to confess the bitterness of a continent dragged through centuries of fire, only to be told they are the ones holding the matchstick. Ibrahim Traoré did not rise from ambition. He rose from despair. He was not groomed in marble halls or raised with silver in his mouth. He was born into a country whose soil held gold and uranium, yet whose people fetched water from muddy rivers shared with animals. The world saw Burkina Faso as a poor country. But Ibrahim saw something else, a land robbed blind in daylight while its children memorized foreign languages before their own tribal names. When Ibrahim became a soldier, it wasn't because he craved power. It was because in a world built to break nations like his own, Burkina Faso, he had only two choices: fight or disappear. Africa did not give him a throne. It gave him fire, the fire to resist. In those early years, he stayed quiet. He listened. He watched and he waited, not for an opportunity but for a crack in the silence, a moment when truth could enter without being shot. Far away in the southern tip of the continent, Helen Zille lived in a different Africa, one with beachfront properties, functioning hospitals, clean streets, and well-funded universities. She had made a name for herself as a journalist, a politician, a woman of intellect and sharp debate. To many, she was a voice of reason, a fighter for clean government in a land plagued by corruption. But comfort has a way of clouding memory. Zille wrote that colonialism wasn't all bad. She pointed to roads, railways, and courtrooms. She defended her view with data, historical references, and calm confidence. Her supporters clapped. Her critics screamed. But none of that changed what she believed deep down, that colonialism, in some twisted way, had civilized Africa. But there were things she had never seen, things no spreadsheet could explain. She had never walked barefoot through a village still haunted by the ghosts of scorched earth campaigns. She had never had to explain to a mother why her child would die because the clinic ran out of penicillin. She had never seen a classroom, with no chairs, no books, no windows, where children sat on stones and learned alphabets from chalk drawn on broken walls. She lived in a country with its own scars, yes, but also with privileges inherited from those very systems she believed had developed the continent. And so, far from the microphones and panel discussions, a different kind of message was forming. Not a speech, not a press release, but a reckoning. A message not written to argue but to remind. Not designed to shame but to awaken. It was not a war letter. It was a truth teller. It was the voice of a continent refusing to be lectured by those who never bled for its pain. Traoré's rise was not just political. It was spiritual. He did not want applause. He wanted justice. He wanted Africa to stop looking in the mirror and seeing shame, to see power instead. And that message, that truth, would soon echo beyond borders. Change didn't come through speeches. It came through silence, the kind that follows a decision that cannot be undone. Then came the shock that rippled across global boardrooms. Traoré announced the state would begin taking back control of its own natural resources. The gold, the manganese, the uranium, no longer to be siphoned off under colonial-era contracts. What is under our soil, he said in a rare public statement, belongs to those who sleep above it. It was a quiet earthquake. Multinational companies began to panic. Western media fired up their headlines. Burkina Faso turns authoritarian. Young leader threatens regional stability. Military regime risks alienating allies. But on the ground, something different was happening, something harder to explain with bullet points. People began to talk about dignity, not as a dream, but as something felt in the air. And all the while Ibrahim said little. And that's when the letter began to take shape. Though unwritten in ink, its words were clear. Its message was spreading through actions, carried by change. And it found its way like a whisper on the wind all the way to Helen Zille's world. At first she dismissed the noise. She had heard it all before, angry young men blaming the West for their own failures. She believed in responsibility, in self-governance, in reform, not revolution. But this time something felt different. It wasn't anger that shook the continent. It was certainty. There was no more begging for aid, no more waiting for approval. There was only one direction: forward, with or without the world's permission. Zille watched the news with growing unease. She saw streets in Ouagadougou flooded, with youth waving their national flag, not in protest but in pride. She read op-eds calling Traoré a symbol of African resistance and saw neighboring countries echoing his moves: Mali, Niger, Guinea. The winds were shifting, and behind the headlines, one question began to haunt her, not publicly, but privately. Had they misunderstood Africa all along? Now she was being forced to look down and see. The letter Ibrahim never wrote finally reached Helen Zille, not through official channels, not through ambassadors, but through the unmistakable voice of a continent refusing to be misunderstood any longer. In the letter, Ibrahim wrote, "Madame Zille, do you know what it feels like to bury children who were not even old enough to curse their killers?" That was the first question I asked myself as I watched mothers lower their babies into shallow graves. Not because of war, but because their village clinic had no medicine. A child died from fever, and all the roads you praise for being built by colonial hands led nowhere when her body went cold. You once said colonialism was not all bad. You said it brought law and order, railways and roads, infrastructure and systems. But tell me, who are those systems built for? The roads took our gold and gave us graveyards. The laws protected those who came to take, not those who tried to live. The railways didn't carry our people to opportunity. They carried our resources to ships. You see order, we see extraction, you see development, we see dismantling of our languages, our spirits, our sense of self. You speak of civilization, but I grew up in a place where the same foreign flags you say brought order also burned our harvests and silenced our fathers. So no, Madame Zille, I do not write this letter to argue. I write it to ask you to see what you have never had to. You have never had to explain to a mother why she must watch her child cough blood because the foreign aid arrived too late. You have never sat with a teacher who hasn't been paid in 3 months still walking miles to a school without chalk or windows. You have never had to convince a boy to stay in school when all he sees is poverty in his teacher's eyes. You live in an Africa that still wears the perfume of privilege. We breathe its smoke. But let me be clear, I'm not asking for sympathy. We are not asking for permission. We are taking back what was always ours, our voice, our resources, our right to fail and rise again on our own terms. Africa is not a broken child to be pitied. It is an adult waking from centuries of sedation. Angry, yes, but also clear-eyed. You don't have to agree with our methods. You don't have to like our leaders. But you will have to accept this. We will no longer be managed. If your history begins in 1652, ours begins long before the ships arrived. And if you still think the greatest gift Africa received was discipline and direction, then perhaps the greatest truth you've missed is this: we were never lost. We were never yours to fix. Zille sat in her study, the glow of a laptop screen casting long shadows on her face. The words she had once spoken with confidence now echoed back to her with a strange hollowness. She remembered the backlash when she tweeted about colonialism, the anger, the criticism, the firm rebuttals. But she had defended herself then. She stood on history, statistics, and belief. Now she saw what she had never been forced to see. The numbers meant nothing if they were written in blood. The history was incomplete if it only told one side. And belief, no matter how sincere, could still be blind. This was the breaking point. The reality was no longer about two people, a military leader and a retired politician. It was about two truths colliding. One, that power often rewrites history to justify itself. And two, that no people can ever be truly free until they are allowed to tell their own story in their own voice. The world, meanwhile, continued to debate. Some called him a liberator, others a populist, a few a threat. But he didn't care, because for the first time in generations, children in Burkina Faso looked up at the flag and didn't see a symbol of what was taken from them. They saw a future they could build. And so the letter, the one never signed, never sealed, became more than a message. It became a mirror, for Africa to see itself, for the world to see Africa not as a problem to fix, not as a failure to pity, but as a people rising, not for revenge, but for respect.